So in the last video about Quarx, I covered the VIC-20 version and some of the design challenges I had with that. And then I promised to do an update on the PET and C64 versions, and that's what we're going to look at today, along with some interesting challenges getting a VIC-20 cartridge made, and trying the game out on the new Commodore 64 Ultimate. The PET is one of the more interesting computers to code for, and part of the reason is because there really just aren't a lot of games out there for it. If you take the C64, for example, if you jump into coding for that, well, one of the things you're going to find right away is that there's thousands of games for the system already. And whatever game it is that you think you have in mind that you're going to write for the C64, chances are there's already another game out there more or less exactly like it, but better than the one that you're going to code. With the PET, on the other hand, it's exactly the opposite. Whatever game that you code for the PET is likely to be the best version of that game for the system. In fact, perhaps for that reason, along with the availability of systems like the Mini PET, there's been a resurgence of development for the system over the last few years. Beyond pesky robots, there have been games like Hey Taxi, Petsky Brothers, Petsky side-scrolling adventure, which is obviously a clone of Super Mario Brothers, Pet Frog, Petsky Kong, and of course, most impressive of all, Escape from Petsky Castle. And so, I took the VIC-20 version of the game, and believe it or not, in about 4 days' time, I had a working, playable version of the game for the PET. I had originally tried to come up with a title screen more similar to the VIC-20 version, but I just couldn't make anything look good with Petsky graphics, so I just did the add-in here. It was also an interesting challenge to come up with 4 unique block sets made entirely out of Petsky characters. Obviously, there was no way to copy the designs I had used for the VIC-20, but there were also other challenges that were less obvious. For example, I had to limit the number of shapes that extended all the way edge to edge. Otherwise, they tend to blend together in the game, and it can be hard to tell where one shape ends and the next begins. But I think these all work pretty well. So let's start the game and have a look. I managed to keep the background animation patterns. They are all the exact same animation patterns used on the VIC-20 version, just represented with whatever available characters I could find to use. The star field was pretty easy to do since I could just use periods, for example. And as you can see, the game is quite fun and playable on the PET. I'll show you playing with a different block set. And here's another. I used my custom designed Mini PET for testing. I did a whole video on this thing a few years ago, and I still use it from time to time for things like this. So one sore spot for the PET is always music. There's really just not a good tracker program out there for it, although it is actually possible to make some pretty cool music on the PET. For example, the Faulty Robots demo that Shiro did a few years ago is super impressive. Although, he's using the CPU to help produce some of these sounds, so it's a bit more CPU interrupt intensive than typical PET music. We tried a similar approach to the VIC-20 version where Noel designed a title theme in Furnace, and we converted it over with a script, and I'll let you hear how that sounds. So it's not bad. Troy Ablin designed the converter and wrote a playback routine for the PET, and I had a little trouble integrating it into the game. As you can hear, this sounds like a robot gone crazy. I eventually figured out the problem there, and as you can hear, it sounds more or less correct in the emulator. When I tried on real hardware, it doesn't work right, and neither of us have figured out why. So instead, I wrote a brand new sound engine from scratch for the PET, and the sound effects are pretty cool, in my opinion, especially considering how limited the sound system is. And then I created a custom 2-voice playback system where it alternates voices very quickly to give the illusion of 2 voices. But it doesn't really sound good enough to warrant doing the whole soundtrack, so it only has the title screen music. Still, I had fun making the PET version, and I hope it is a nice addition to the software library for the machine. Going back to the VIC-20 for a bit, I really wanted to get the game working on a cartridge, which ended up being kind of challenging. Take a look at this memory map of the VIC-20. I knew I could fit the game in this contiguous 24K section here, but I also knew I needed slightly more RAM than a stock system, so I asked Kevin if we could design a cartridge that would include this 3K of expansion RAM here, and then also add 24K of ROM here, And he said no problem, so I began to alter the code to work in ROM.
I had to rework quite a bit of code because I had intertwined a lot of variables within the code, and of course you can't have variables in ROM. Likewise, I had a number of places where I used self-modifying code, and well, can't have that either. But even once I got all that sorted out, it still just didn't quite work right.
So I reached a point where I could attach the ROM images and the computer would boot to BASIC, and I would need to type SYS8192 to start the game. So it turns out, by placing the game in this part of the memory map, there was no way to boot it automatically. And this answered a question I'd had long wondered about. There were a number of VIC-20 cartridges back in the day that had instructions like this on the top of the cartridge. Because basically the cartridge wouldn't boot on its own. You had to type in an SYS command to start the game, even though it was a cartridge game. You see, Commodore, in their infinite wisdom, designed the kernel to only look for a boot signature in this 8K ROM area up here. So if your game couldn't fit in 8K, then you need to stuff some of it in the lower area, but that means the code is split in a weird way. And I guess a lot of games decided it was easier just to keep all the game contiguous and didn't want to spend the money for an extra ROM chip up here just to hold a few bytes of a boot signature. Well, I wanted my game to be able to boot on its own, so we went ahead and added that 8K. But then I thought, maybe I could put something cool in there since it was almost 8K of unused space. So I added this little boot graphic of the original VIC-20 mascot and catchphrase, which appear for a couple of seconds before the game starts. And now it's time to test the cartridge for the first time. Kevin has brought over a prototype PCB and his VIC-20, and lucky him, he got his VIC-20 autographed by William Shatner. He used mostly modern parts to keep the cost down, which is fine. It's going to be inside of a shell anyway. Nobody's going to see it. But for the moment, we don't have any shells, so we'll just carefully insert it like so. His VIC-20 has a bad cap or something because it takes an unusually long time to boot, even without a cartridge. And it works! I was so excited to see this come to life on a real VIC-20 as a cartridge. Well, the next challenge was to find cartridge shells, and it turns out nobody's making them anymore. We thought about doing our own 3D design and having them resin printed, but time was short, so we found that the future was 8-bit actually sells empty shells, so I ordered a few hundred of them, and they have just arrived. And I have to admit, I'm not terribly fond of the design, mostly because there isn't a lot of space for a label, but we'll make do. I'll go ahead and mount the PCB inside the shell to make sure it fits. And it does. So now to test the label. Now, this is just a prototype label we made on an inkjet printer, but if it fits, then I'll bulk order these, and yeah, it looks like it fits. All that's left is to make some sort of sleeve, similar to this one here, but for Quarx.
Okay, so now it's time to talk about the C64 version of the game. This is the version most people will probably be interested in. I spent a lot of time thinking about this game, and I could have gone the easy route. I could have just done a more or less as-is port from the VIC-20 version, and, well, I could have had that done in like 3 days, and it would have looked almost exactly like the VIC-20 version, maybe just slightly better.
So, as an interesting example, Commodore made Radar Rat Race for the VIC-20, and then the next year they came out with the C64 version, and the truth is you can barely tell them apart, and they just most likely reused most of the VIC-20 code. But I really wanted to make this feel like a purpose-designed C64 game. And I know I showed you some graphics tests we did early on between the different modes, and I really wanted to use the multicolor bitmap mode, but I also knew having a fast-moving animation was going to be a challenge in this mode because there's so much more data to write to the screen.
Really, everything boiled down to my ability to come up with some way to do the animation and have it work as quickly and smooth as on the VIC-20. If I couldn't come up with a way to do it, I'd have to resort back to just using character mode, just like it did on the VIC-20. But I finally came up with a plan. What if I didn't modify the pixel colors at all, and instead just modified the palette for each color cell?
Now, at first thought, you're probably thinking that it would be really blocky looking, such as in this mock-up, but I realized in multicolor mode, there are 3 unique colors per cell. So what if I placed groups of dithered pixels in patterns like these, and just turned groups of pixels on and off by changing the palette? So that's exactly what I did, and in this early test, you can see that I have the animation working in bitmap mode, using nothing but color palette changes. Now the patterns look very similar to the VIC-20, but are slightly better since I have usually more than one shade of a color to work with on the C64. But I did try to stick to darker colors for the background when possible so it wouldn't visually overpower the falling shapes. Anyway, point is, this was a success, and I knew I could move forward with using multicolor bitmap mode. Another challenge I had was that in the VIC-20 and PET versions, I could simply read the screen RAM to figure out if it was okay to move the animation without overriding the main shapes. But on this version, that would be very complicated since I'd be reading bitmap data, not characters. So instead, the game would have to keep track of where everything is on the screen in the background. You can see an early prototype here where I've placed 3 prototype shapes on the screen that don't have their palette overwritten by the animation routine. Keep in mind, I have to draw these as bitmap graphics too. You might wonder why I can't use hardware sprites, and there's a good reason for that. Just a refresher on C64 sprites. You have your standard monochrome sprite, which has 2 colors, foreground and background. Obviously, this isn't going to work to display my colorful shapes. So what about multicolor sprites? Well, they have 4 colors per sprite, but that's still not enough. One problem is that the 2 extra colors and background are shared between all sprites. Only the foreground color is unique on a per sprite basis. And then there's the issue that the shapes I'm using occupy 4 different color cells, and I could technically have 3 unique colors per cell. Multiply that by 4, and that's 12 unique colors possible for each shape. Although in practice it tends to work out to 5 or 6 colors, still more than can be done in a single sprite. And I'm kind of getting ahead of myself because at this point I still don't have any block set graphics drawn, but I knew that when I did they'd be very colorful. So moving along, the next goal was to get the game actually playing using my prototype graphics, and I could already tell one problem I was going to run into. Whenever it made a match, it had to redraw the entire playfield, and you may notice it simply can't do it all in one frame because there's so much data to write. So the background disappears for a split second. So I took a lesson from Petsky Robots where we ran into the same problem on some of the systems that ran in bitmap mode, and the answer was to only redraw tiles that had actually changed, leave the rest alone. And so that's exactly what I ended up doing here. And so jumping ahead a bit, you can see I have some graphics in place, and the background doesn't miss a beat anymore, even after a call to redraw the playfield occurs. Now for the music, I once again hired Noelle to write the SID music. I loved the tunes she created for the VIC-20, and I wanted to stick with the same tunes, only have them sound cooler on the SID chip, and that's exactly what we got. So here's a few comparisons of the music. In addition to the single SID version, I heavily considered adding support for 2 SID chips in as an option. And Noelle did in fact compose one of the songs as a test for this, and I'll let you hear a little comparison between the standard 3-voice version and the 6-voice version. See what you think.
So ultimately, I decided not to go with the dual SID version, partly because it was going to cost me more money to get the music developed, but also because I just really didn't think there were going to be enough people that could actually make use of it, and even those who could, I just didn't feel like the quality was significantly better enough to be worth the trouble. But there was also a technical challenge as well. So as it is, the current SID track is about 9K, and it all fits in RAM. And if I'm going to double the number of voices, then that's probably going to double the size of the soundtrack to 18K. And that's just not going to fit in RAM. I'd have to load bits of it in. And that's something I did not want to do because, as you see, the way this game works, it just changes songs as you're playing. And I didn't want the game to stop and have it load from the disk drive a new song and then keep playing again. So it would require a massive undertaking. I'd probably have to do REU support or something like that, and I just don't want to go that route.
Eventually, I got the title screen graphics in place, and I wanted to have some animation going like the VIC-20 version. So there's a little highlight that travels across the logo and the atoms are flashing. And I mean, I thought the VIC-20 title screen looked pretty cool, but the C64 version really does take it to the next level, just as it should. So let's take a look at some actual gameplay. I must congratulate Piotr on his amazing pixel art. It really helps take this to the next level. And here's with a different block set. One of my beta testers commented that this game looks like it was designed by one of the C64 demo scene groups. I was quite flattered to hear that. So obviously I needed to test on real hardware, and I've tested a number of times on my Breadbin C64 here at home. And of course I use a real CRT, and to be honest, I think the game looks even better on a CRT. And some of the dithered patterns sort of merge due to the inherent blurriness, and the colors just seem to pop more. I've also tested on my C64C up at the Time Rift a number of times. In fact, the game is on there for anyone to play right next to the VIC-20 version. And I also just received a gift directly from Parafractic himself, which is the brand new C64 Ultimate. And here in a minute, we'll set that up and try the game out on that. But before that, I just wanted to mention a few Easter eggs. For one thing, you can totally play this with a standard joystick connected to port 2, but I've always strongly believed C64 games should be keyboard playable as well, even though most developers never included that. So I used the same keyboard layout as on the VIC-20 and PET versions. And you may be wondering what this 1 to 5 feature is. Well, all of my games to date have included this jukebox feature where at the title screen, you can listen to all the songs in the game by pressing one of the number keys. This Easter egg goes all the way back to my Ultimate days where Origin gave us that feature. So, back to the C64 Ultimate. This is my first time opening the box and having a look at it. This isn't a full review, but I'll give you some initial impressions. The box is very nice and definitely has those C64 vibes. I got the clear version, which is totally fine. The printed manual is also very nice and well done. It seems heavily based on the original, but has been updated for the new machine where needed. And I got a kick out of this. It looks like a cassette tape called The Very Second, which is clearly a joke because the original C64 came with one called The Very First. However, it's not actually a cassette. If you pull it out here, you'll see it's actually a USB drive with some software on it. I was happy to see the original analog video port on the back because I was afraid this machine was going to be HDMI only. Of course, it does have HDMI as well, but so that means I should just be able to unplug my old Breadbin I was using for testing and swap this unit right in. Yep, video cable fits fine, and I'm using separated video as I modded this TV to support it. Original joysticks fit fine. Well, we won't be needing the original power cable, which I can't say I'm sad about. Instead, it just has a barrel jack and is powered from this little wall wart transformer. Anyway, it's powered on. Well, I can immediately see one problem. It boots to PAL mode, which my TV does not support, so I had to have a look at the manual and found out there is a key combination to temporarily boot to NTSC mode, and that worked. Then I can enter the menu and then make sure it's configured for NTSC, and then save that to flash. So I should be good enough from here on out. So now I'll plug in my USB drive with Quarx on board and see if it works. And after playing a few minutes, I can't tell any difference between playing it on my Breadbin other than the video is slightly sharper and the screen is slightly offset to the right of the TV for some reason, but it's not a big deal. I also tried the REU version of Petsky Robots since this machine has REU support built in, and it works fine for that too. Oh, and one last thing, there is something here called CommaServe. It's an online database it can connect to, and there's going to be adding all sorts of software in there. And I had them add in the shareware version of Quarx and Petsky Robots. So, for example, if you just search for Quarx, you'll find it. The shareware version has this little nag screen at the start, and it's missing some of the block sets, music, and animation patterns. But the first 4 levels are pretty much intact from the usual. But anyway, moving on. I still don't have a box yet for this game, and that's basically the last piece of the puzzle. In the past, I've been using the same physical box design for most of my games. The trouble is, this game doesn't really need a manual, at least not one the size of my previous games. So I've been thinking about how Electronic Arts used to use these LP style boxes. And I think something like this would be perfect, as I could put any instructions in the middle and then just have a pocket for the disc. Since I had 2 of these Worms boxes and one wasn't in great shape, I decided to disassemble this one so I could see exactly how it's made and what the dimensions are. And so I'm currently talking with the print shop, and I hope to get something really similar to these made. I also want to mention here that there's at least one more port on the way, the Apple II. Ian Brumby is doing this port. He's the same mastermind that did the Petsky robots for the Apple II. And I asked him if such a game could even be done on the Apple II, and he was pretty sure it could. Now what you're seeing here is a proof of concept where he just ported the game enough to see it run in text mode so that all the game mechanics are working. And now he's working on converting it to run in double high-res mode, which should look really nice and colorful. Noel is already working on Mockingboard music for it as well.
Okay, so some people are going to ask, am I going to do an MS-DOS port? And I think the answer is no. And if you think about it logically for a moment, I mean, this game is a clone of Zixit, which is an MS-DOS game. So if you really just want to play the game so bad on MS-DOS, just play Zixit. And then some people make the case, this is, well, yeah, but Zixit requires like a 46 and a Sound Blaster and VGA graphics. And what if you wanted to play the game on like CGA or EGA with, ad-lib sound or whatever, and Quarx could do that in theory. And that's a valid argument to make. The trouble is, having done surveys of people who have bought my previous 2 games for MS-DOS, I've found that 95% of the audience plays those games in VGA mode, which means only 5% of them are playing in some other mode. So for that small little fraction of people that want something other than VGA, I don't think it's worth the trouble to develop a whole new game for MS-DOS. All right, so I've got a couple more things to talk about before wrapping up this video. So one thing I wanted to mention is that, like, when I first did the VIC-20 version of this game, I mean, it only took me like a month. And for me, that's super fast because all of the previous games I've done have been really complex, like real-time strategy games for Petsky robots, which are like these immersive worlds with all kinds of interactivity and stuff like that. And those took, sometimes better part of a year to develop those. And this game the game mechanic is relatively simple. And so I could do it relatively quickly. And I think that that's kind of a piece of advice I want to give to people who are always asking me about getting into programming. And which is, start with a simple project. A puzzle game or something like this is, it's not the end-all be-all of game coding, but it is something you can finish relatively quickly and not get frustrated in the middle of it and abandon it. And that brings me to the last thing, which is I'd really like to write another game for the VIC-20 or C64 or both in the early part of 2026. And I've been thinking about going back and looking at the library of old games that came out in like 1980, 81, 82 that Commodore or maybe a third party did for the VIC-20 or 64 that weren't very good, but could have been much better. So just some examples off the top of my head would be like Radar Rat Race or Vaduzzles or Jack Attack or something like that. And I think, wouldn't it be cool to take a game like that and just completely remake it and do like really cool graphics, really cool soundtrack, and just have it be like vastly remastered version of something like that. So I'm curious what you guys think would be a good candidate for that. You can put it down in the comment section. I'll try to read them all. But that's it for this episode. As always, thanks for watching.